The time is 937 in England under Athelstan has been a united nation for just over a decade, previous to this it being a collection of warring fiefdoms united by a common language were divided politically at Brunanburh in the time 937 nearly in the north of England, and as yet unknown place a battle was fought, Athelstan and the English on one side and a triple alliance of fiefdoms. On the other, Scotland led by Constantine the Alternate, the Britannic area of Strathclyde led by King Owen in the North Kingdom of Dublin led by Olaf Goth. Written such was the heritage of the battle that in this time of the annalist subsequently writing in the late 901 and BR was still known as the Great Battle by the common people. It was a battle that would decide the future of the British Islands, so much so that according to annalist Michael Livingstone the position was chosen in agreement with the commanders and the supposition that there would be one fight and to the victor went England ever since. Rome had pulled out of Britain the early 400s in the wake of Arburian vanquishing more vital areas of the empire. Eruption from overseas had come the norm, just as the landmass Romans has suffered eruption after eruption by quarrelsome societies from across the Rhine, such the Goths, the Franks, the Defacers and the Huns. Britain to have seen as easy pickings for the quarrelsome societies of ultramodern day northern Germany and Denmark. The Anglo-Saxons as they came to be known represented numerous different societies similar as the Dukes Anglo-Saxons and Frisies, who feel to have traveled across the North Sea first as aggressors, latterly as settlers in the medial 50 came to England, still heavily disputed by chroniclers largely due to a significant lack of dependable sources from this time period, this being one of the reasons why the period is traditionally known as the Dark Period's enterprise is replete as to whether the Anglo-Saxons were invited by the Romans as supplementary mercenaries employed to help cover the fiefdom from analogous vagrant peoples like themselves, or whether seeing weakness they took it upon themselves to attack the former Roman fiefdom. In any case, whether invited or not, the Anglo-Saxons waged war on the being occupants of Britain. The Romano-Celtic Brittonic fiefdoms, which had been peopled by an admixture of Celtic and Roman culture, had filled the void after Rome called out. This was a well-established culture which formed and prospered over numerous centuries. If King Arthur did live also, it's likely that he was a Platonic warlord who fought against the Anglo-Saxons in the wake of the power vacuum left by Rome's withdrawal during the 5th and 6th centuries. In any case, the Britannic fiefdoms were devastated and replaced by Anglo-Saxons, leaving only Wales, Cornwall and Scottish lowlands of the Brittonic rule. Scotland and Ireland, of course no way been conquered by the Romans, was still possessed a true Celtic rule, who in Scotland sounded to be calling themselves Pict by this point, were notorious for covering their bodies in intricate woved and tattoos. Occupants of Ireland during this period sounded to have called themselves Gaels, although this distinction between them and the Snaps is relatively fluidic at this point. At some point along the line the Snaps began calling themselves the Scots, the Fits began calling themselves Irish, but again the lines blur together quite a bit then, given that both sides of the Irish ca largely artistic modulus at most of their history, and also there is the sheer lack of written sources to work with. Both Scotland and Ireland had been Christian for numerous times, now stood at odds with the idolater Anglo-Saxon beginners. After wiping out enslaving of driving down the Romani, Britain's Anglo-Saxons soon settled in rich lands of Britain began to form a number of distant fiefdoms similar as Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia and Kent. All waged war amongst themselves for the coming several centuries, gradationally swallowing up lower fiefdoms until only a sprinkle remained. The main problem in all of this still is the sources. They're incredibly hard to come by. Much of our knowledge from this period comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written much latterly, and from ecclesial histories from the likes of Bede, who inescapably portrayed the history through their own lens, and again were written much latterly by the 7th century. Substantiation of Roman influence over England largely faded. Large remains did remain similar as at Londinium and at York, but the beginners tended to settle in their own municipalities of wood, next to the old Roman municipalities of gravestone, which remained as a stark memorial of how far engineering at least had fallen. There was Mercia, largely peopled by Angles and Saxons, which historically had been the most important state offer of offers. Unbar fame had been immersive. They tended to have their capital in the East Midlands. Northumbria was the northern kingdom at his power base at the ancient Roman megacity of York. East Anglia enthralled the same position roughly as the ultramodern day county, and eventually Wessex, the most notorious of the bunch, was grounded in the south. The Anglo-Saxons began converting to Christianity eventually during the 7th century, largely through the sweats of Irish monks who had formerly been Christian for hundreds of times now, and developed a distinct style of Celtic Christianity unique to their islet. Gradationally, despite still being separated by political borders, a distinctly English erudite tradition and culture began to develop, the base of what would Latterly come the culture of the ultramodern-day nation-state of England. The Anglo-Saxons who had raided England did not live in a vacuum. The lands to the north of Saxony had long developed a militaristic culture which was also maritime in nature. This makes sense until veritably lately it was always easier to get around the arms and veil systems of Scandinavia by a boat rather than road. The emphasis on the ocean as a provider rather than the harsh soils of the north can indeed be seen in grave spots dating back hundreds of times before the Viking Age. This preoccupation with the ocean combined with the natural failure of coffers and decreasingly large population that small bands of Northland to begin to look outwards to foreign lands to give a future for themselves by the late 8th century, first as dealers and latterly as soldiers. Long boats packed full of opportunistic Northmen began raiding the plages of Britain. They came looking for land and wealth, and having formerly established bases for themselves in the Faroe Islets several decades before, headlong they began settling in Ireland, on the Scottish Islands, and eventually upon the props of the not yet united land which would come to be known as England. Although the rich erudite tradition of Rome had failed when the Anglo-Saxons at first raided in the 5th century, sluggishly and surely a new distinctly English bone have developed to take its place, one inescapably framed by the new Christian faith of its votaries in 793 and Lindisfarne Friary in Northumbria. Some of these votaries, the monks who lived and worked there, were shocked and alarmed to witness dark cruises upon the horizon one morning. Little did they know that long boats would only display a snarling head upon their vessel when they were going Viking or raiding. When they went to trade, no similar displays would be shown on that morning at the tell-tale snarling dragon heads came into view. The monks at Lindisfarne were about to witness firsthand the winning of a new age, a Viking age. The raid was just one of numerous during this period which were only going to increase in the compass and inflexibility, each over the British Islands and much further amiss as the centuries went on, and as more and more tales of overseas riches and fortunes to be had trickled back to Scandinavia. More and more opportunistic and hopeless youthful man reserved outwards from the barren motherland to make a name for themselves. It was not long before full-scale eruption were launched from across the Northern Ocean. The Northumbrian and East Anglias had now been Christian for hundreds of times and had grown content and perfunctory in their rich English lands. They were now faced by their former characters. These beginners were heathens. They worshipped the pantheon of North gods led by Odin. The Anglo-Saxons just a couple of centuries ahead had worshipped Woden, the same god the great barbarian army, as it was dubbed by the Christian pens of the period, swept through the divided Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 1860s, snuffing out their existences one by one and replacing them with puppet rulers or outright just putting themselves on a throne. By the 1870s the Northland had established a large foothold in the northeast of England which would come to be known as the Danelaw. The legacy of the Danelaw can still be seen today in the place names and surnames still reminiscent that Danish origins. By 871 King Alfred of Wessex, a sickly God-fearing man, was the only Anglo-Saxon king left between the Scandinavians' total dominance of England. Alfred had other ideas however, and after a number of setbacks he rallied the field together for one final stand against their cousins to the north. Eddington in 878 the men of Wessex were finally victorious in defeating the Northmen when some way to was shattering the reputation unbeatable fighters and turning the tide against the invaders. Over the next decades Alfred and his descendants worked hard to lay the foundations of the united Angle, and partly motivated by desire to defend themselves against the new invaders from the sea, partly unsure out of a desire for power and prestige of the other disparate kingdoms of Britain. Meanwhile, by 937 the Northmen, many of the Norwegian origin rather than the largely Danish manhood, invaded England, had become a huge force in the rest of Britain and Ireland. They established themselves significant footholds in Ireland and Scotland. Ireland, having first been settled by Norwegians during the and 9th centuries, was made up of a number of war and native Irish kingdoms, but by now also had a strong Scandinavian influence, many of whom had lived there for over 100 years now in places like Dublin, which had been founded by Norwegians, as did the Scottish Isles and the Isle of Man, which were made strongholds for centuries to come. Well into the medieval period Dublin, not content to sit on its wealth any longer, looked across the Irish Sea to expand this influence into northern England. Scotland had also changed a fair bit since the time of the Picts several centuries earlier, at some stage largely because of the melting pot of Gaelic, Pictish, Christian, Mittonic and Germanic influences, began to develop its own Scottish identity under the new King Constantine. Upon completing the unification of England in 927, Alfred's grandson and successor Athelstan looked to the north to expand further. Just a handful of years after unification it would be the turn of the English to become the foreign invader, a role which they would take on many more times over the next millennia. By 934, Athelstan, having consolidated his rule after completing the unification process which his grandfather Alfred started all those years ago, seems to have moved his forces into Scotland, which was ruled by Constantine II at the time. The motivations for this are unclear, whether Athelstan had his sights set on the rest of Britain, or whether the attack was preempting an invasion by the Scottish who, some sources say, had broken a truce, although there are several literary sources from this period, mostly in the forms of poems and songs. They aren't all that reliable. It is difficult to know exactly what was going on. It does seem clear to me though that even at this early stage the British just really loved to invade Scotland. By 937 hostilities had come to a head. Constantine was joined in alliance King Owen of the Brittonic kingdom of Strathclyde, a relic of the past left over from those post-Roman years of Romano-Briton dominance over Britain. The British kings were also joined by Olaf of Dublin, a powerful Irish-Norse king who was possibly looking to become the dominant force in the British Isles. The alliance was likely one of convenience, aimed at curtailing the growing power of Athelstan. Whatever the motivations for the battle, its exact whereabouts have never been conclusively located. Just like the location of Arthur's final battle, it may always remain, like much of this period in history, unknown. Personally, I think the fact that we know so little about it in itself is accurately representative of this time period. We may surmise that the armies had as many as 5,000 or more on either side, not nearly as many as the Romans once fielded against their major opponents, but large enough to match one another. They would have been roughly equivalent in technology with the elite household guard or housecarls, equipped with swords, large shields, helmets and armor. Vast majority of the Saxon army would have been made up of the fjord, which had been made up of peasantry. They would likely have been armed with anything they could get their hands on. During this period there was no standard armor or uniform. If you were rich enough, you could afford good equipment and you stood a better chance of survival. The Northern Alliance would likely have been armed in a similar manner to the Saxons. The armies would have arrayed themselves in a shield wall formation, which in itself was a curious throwback to a half-remembered Roman battle tactic. The armies would have faced off against each other using largely the same tactics. They studied tight formation with their shields locked. Both sides would wait each other out into one push forward finally to engage the other. Then it will be shield wall versus shield war, man versus man. The battle was fierce and many died on both sides. According to the poem The Battle of Brunanburh in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Saxons eventually managed to split the shield wall and huge battle shields with the remnants of hammers. There lay many a warrior by spears destroy the Northern men shot over shield. Likewise Scottish as well. Weary war sated it was Athelstan in England who would emerge victorious from the battle, but losses were heavy on both sides. So much showed that the situation appears to largely have been a stalemate. Afterwards a battle of Brunanburh recounted that there were never yet as many killed before this with swords edged, since from the east Angles and Saxons came up over the broad sea. In the aftermath of the battle Olaf fled and sailed back to Dublin with the remnants of his army. Constantine escaped north into Scotland. King Owen's fate is not mentioned, although Strathclyde declined until it faded altogether. 1093 Athelstan, although victorious, had lost much of his army and his power steadily declined. After Day's death King Olaf of Dublin managed to claim the kingdom of Northumbria without resistance, effectively ending the first unification of England. But England was once again united by 946, and by 954 upon that Eric blood axe the Norse eventually lost all of their remaining territory in York and Northumbria. For the English, Athelstan's victory had prevented the dissolution of England unity. For the Scottish and the Irish it marked the beginning of a legacy of invasion from England which would continue for the next millennia, although England had by no means seen the last of the Vikings, who would continue to attack for centuries to come, and even be outward conquered again by them under rulers like Canute and half the Canute. The English had however at Brunanburh asserted themselves as the united people who would dominate the British Isles for the